In the autumn of 1415, on a rain-soaked field in northern France, 6,000 exhausted English soldiers stood facing 20,000 French knights. Starving, sick, and far from home, they held their ground. Not with numbers, but with discipline, terrain, and the deadly reach of the longbow. What happened that day would not only redefine the legacy of a young king, but change the nature of war itself. The Battle of Agincourt took place on October 25th, 1415, during the 100 Years' War between England and France. It became one of the most famous military victories in English history, not because of sheer power, but because of planning, discipline, and the effective use of terrain. By 1415, the war had already lasted more than 75 years. England's young King Henry V wanted to reassert his claim to the French crown, a claim rooted in old dynastic disputes going back to Edward III. Henry also needed a victory to secure his rule at home, unify his nobles, and give England a sense of national purpose. In August 1415, he led an army of about 12,000 men across the English Channel to invade France. The campaign began with the siege of Harfleur, a fortified port on the northern coast. The siege dragged on for weeks, and disease, especially dysentery, ravaged the English troops. When Harfleur finally surrendered, Henry had already lost a large portion of his force. Henry then made a risky decision. Instead of returning home, he decided to march his weakened army across northern France toward the English-held town of Calais. His men were exhausted, hungry, and in poor condition. Meanwhile, the French mobilized a much larger army to cut him off before he could reach safety. By late October, Henry found his path blocked near the village of Agincourt in northern France. The French army numbered around 20,000, more than 3 times the size of the English force. The situation looked hopeless on paper.
Have mercy upon us. Saint George, hear our prayers.
Henry chose his ground carefully. The battlefield was a narrow strip of open land, bordered by 2 patches of dense forest. Heavy rain had turned the recently plowed field into deep mud. This terrain would make it difficult for the heavily armored French cavalry and knights to maneuver effectively. Henry placed his men in a defensive formation. In the center were his dismounted knights and men-at-arms, around 2,000 soldiers. On both flanks, he positioned about 4,000 longbowmen, each protected by wooden stakes planted in the ground to stop cavalry charges. This setup forced the French to attack through a narrow funnel, where their superior numbers would count for less. At dawn on October 25th, the 2 armies faced each other across the muddy field. The French expected the English to attack, but Henry held his position. The standoff lasted several hours. Finally, when it became clear the French would not advance, Henry ordered his army to move forward just within bow range, about 200 yards. Then he gave the signal to fire. Thousands of arrows filled the air. The English longbows had a range and rate of fire far greater than any crossbow or early firearm of the time. The first French cavalry charge was shredded before it reached the English lines. Despite the devastating arrow fire, the French continued to advance. The narrow field and the thick mud slowed them down. Men in heavy armor sank knee-deep into the ground. When the front lines fell, the men behind them tripped over their bodies, creating massive congestion. The English longbowmen kept shooting until the enemy was close. then joined the fight with swords, axes, and daggers. The French were crushed by their own momentum. Knights and nobles suffocated under piles of fallen men and horses. In a matter of hours, chaos replaced organization. Throughout the battle, Henry V stayed close to the front. He encouraged his men and fought alongside them. According to several chroniclers, Henry personally engaged in combat and narrowly escaped injury when a blow struck his helmet. This direct leadership, combined with strict discipline, made a major difference. The English army fought as a single coordinated unit, while the French suffered from disorganization and poor communication among their various divisions. By midday, the first two French assaults had completely failed. Thousands of their soldiers were dead or captured. The remaining French commanders hesitated, but decided to try one last attack with their reserves. It ended the same way: more casualties and total exhaustion. At one point, a rumor spread that the French were regrouping for another attack. Worried about being overwhelmed and unable to guard prisoners, Henry made a controversial decision. He ordered many of the captured French knights to be executed. The act shocked his contemporaries but reflected the brutal logic of medieval warfare. By the end of the day, the French army was destroyed. Estimates vary, but roughly 6,000 to 7,000 French soldiers, many of them nobles, were killed. The English lost fewer than 400. Among the dead were several high-ranking French commanders, including the Constable of France, the Duke of Alençon, and the Duke of Bar. The scale of the defeat stunned Europe. The French nobility, once seen as invincible on the battlefield, had been decimated by a smaller, disciplined force of archers and infantry. The victory at Agincourt transformed Henry V's reputation. He returned to England as a national hero and used his success to strengthen his claim over France. In 1420, the Treaty of Troyes formally recognized Henry as heir to the French throne and regent of France. However, Henry died just 2 years later, in 1422, before he could secure his dynasty's rule. Agincourt did not end the 100 Years' War, but it marked one of its most significant turning points. It was one of the most unexpected outcomes in European military history, and a reminder that strategy, not strength, decides who wins a war. Agincourt became part of England's myth, retold in halls, books, and on stage. But legends fade, and only the field remains. Agincourt endures, not as glory, but as a lesson in what leadership, terrain, and belief can overcome. Its silence echoes louder than its victory. And its mud still holds the memory of what men feared and what they defied. If you felt the weight of history here, like, subscribe, and share this moment so it isn't forgotten again.